Hello and welcome to lecture 13. Today we are going to introduce a new tool which is called marginal analysis. Uh, Earlier when we had the introduction to the course, I mentioned that in economics, economists prefer to use a lot of marginal terms, right? So, marginal benefit, marginal cost, marginal revenue, marginal rate of substitution, marginal rate of technological substitution, right. So, all of these terms, in all of these terms, the common element is the word marginal, right. And marginal is a very useful tool for us to learn. And what we will do is, I will first motivate why we need marginal analysis, how can we use marginal analysis, and we will work out a few examples to understand how do you use marginal analysis to make strategic decisions. Okay. So, let me first say that the idea of taking small steps is called marginal analysis in economics. Right. So, it is the idea of taking small steps. Okay. Now, I will write down one more, I will make one more comment and I will motivate that as to what we mean by that comment, right. So, you have reached an optimum when any further small step cannot make you better off. What I mean by that is, the better off could be for a firm which is trying to increase its revenue, it could be a firm which is trying to increase its profit, right. So, the firm is currently producing a certain quantity of the product, right, some number of output units that it is producing, and the firm is asking, is this the best that the firm can do? Well, one way to answer this question is, the firm decides to take a small step. So, just as when you are hiking and you are trying to trek up a hill, you are taking one more step, and if that one more step is going to take you at a higher level on that hill, then the previous step was not the optimal point or was not the topmost point of the hill. But so similarly, for a firm, when it is trying to trek up its revenue hill or profit hill, it is taking one more step. Now, that one more step for the firm is actually producing an additional unit of output. Okay. So, imagine, so let us take an abstract example. Suppose that you are trying to revise a paper for submission, right. So, let us say you have some conference or some seminar in mind and you are trying to submit a paper for that conference, right. So, you are revising a paper for submission, right. Very rarely would it be the case that the first version of the paper is what you end up submitting, right. That is never the way it happens, right. So, we prepare a draft, then you go through that draft, you make multiple rounds of corrections, you do not like something that you have written, you want to rewrite it. So, some of these things you keep on changing, right. So, you are revising a paper for submission. So, typically you will go through multiple rounds of revisions. Before submission. The question that you are asking is, how many rounds of submission do you need before you feel that the paper is good enough for you to submit, right. So, the question is, how do you decide on the number of rounds of revision So, should it be 3 rounds, should it be 4 rounds, or should it be 7 rounds of revision, right? So, how do you decide on the number of rounds of revision required, right? And I claim that marginal analysis will be useful for us to answer this question, right? Now, before the submission, right, it is impossible for you to know. It is impossible to know the number of rounds needed. You may have some estimate, of course, but the exact number of rounds that you need for you to be able to submit the paper is going to be difficult for you to figure out. So, before the submission, it is impossible to know the exact number of rounds needed. But as you begin the revision, you get a sense of the additional benefits and additional costs involved with each round of revision, right. So, a priori I may not be able to tell you that I need 7 rounds of revision, but as I start, right, I started the first round of revision, I will get an estimate, right. I start understanding what are the extra benefits and extra costs that I will encounter in each round of revision, right. So, the benefits of doing the revision, are reducing errors, it is a much improved paper, there is better analysis, right, all the mistakes are removed, right, the presentation is much more clear. So, these are some of the benefits of doing each successive round of revision. The costs, of course, are the costs of effort, right. You really need to spend time on reading the paper, finding out what the errors are, improving the language. You may have to sit in the library, look at references, you look at past literature, right, document all those. All of that requires a lot of effort and there is a cost to it, right. And also that generally takes time away from other things. So, takes time away from other activities, right. So, you get a sense of the benefits and costs. The benefits are the much improved paper and the higher probability that once you submit, the paper gets accepted, but the costs are also these efforts and the time it takes to read, revise, make the corrections and so on, right. Now, so if you think of the first round of revision, right. So, if you think of the first round, right. So, in the first round, some of the checks can be just automated, right. So, for example, you have a document, there are a lot of spelling errors in it, and let us say if you have a Word document, it immediately highlights what are all the errors, and within a few minutes you can actually correct all those spelling errors, right. So, in one shot, right, within a few minutes you have been able to remove most of the sort of spelling mistakes from the document, right. So, that gives you enormous additional benefit, right. So, the previous version in round 0, call round 0 as the baseline, you had a draft which had lot of spelling mistakes. As soon as you move from round 0 to round 1, you now have a draft which has no spelling mistakes, right. So, it is a much improved version. So, the extra benefit, right, this extra benefit is going to have a word, is going to have a specific name, it is also called the marginal benefit. The word marginal also stands for extra. So, extra benefit is also the marginal benefit. I will denote this as MB, right. For the moment, I will just mention that marginal benefit is denoted by MB and it is the extra benefit, right. When we get into the specifics a little later, we will talk about marginal revenue and marginal cost. I will formally define it, okay. So, the extra benefit is much greater than the extra cost. The extra cost was hardly anything, right. So, it just spent a few minutes because the Word document, the document itself, the Word file itself highlighted what are all the spelling mistakes that you had in that document, and you were able to correct it within a few minutes. So, the extra cost is called the marginal cost and is denoted by MC, right. So, in the first round, the extra benefit is greater than the extra cost. So, it is rational for you to take this round of revision. So, you make the revision, right. So, from 0 to round 1, you have got a document which has no spelling mistakes. It is a much improved version of the paper, right. So, now you go to the second round, right. Now, in the second round, it is now, so you need to go beyond simply looking at spelling mistakes, right. So, now you are looking at, are the various sections written properly, right. So, a standard paper would have an introduction section, a literature review section, your model and analysis section, a results section, and then a conclusion section, right. So, you will go section wise, read all of those, right. You will make a lot of changes. You will have to go to the library, look at past literature, right, look at past journals, try and position your work in the context of what has already been done. So, all of that notice is still going to give you a much richer paper. So, there is still going to be an additional benefit, but now compared to round 1, the extra cost is significantly higher, right, because now it is no longer the software telling you what are all the spelling mistakes and you just click and correct those. Now, you will need to go sit in the library, read the documents, make notes, right, and then go back and type it in your document. So, while doing this, so the extra benefit, I will just write it as marginal benefit. The marginal benefit may still be greater than the extra cost, right, but now the marginal benefit and marginal cost levels are a lot closer, right. So, what I mean in have in mind is that imagine the marginal benefit was somewhere here, right, and the marginal cost was low somewhere here in the first round, right. In the second round, there is still a marginal benefit, but the marginal cost is also getting much higher, right. So, the marginal benefit is still greater than the marginal cost. So, you do this round. So, spelling mistakes taken care of, then you focused on improving the content in the paper, you focused on presenting data properly, drawing the graphs, literature review, reading other articles, positioning your work, right, doing an analysis. So, you keep doing these multiple rounds, right. You did a third round, a fourth round, but notice once you keep on doing this round, these successive rounds, let us say perhaps you have reached a sixth round, right, where you find that the paper is a much improved version compared to the version that you started with. So, now it is, so you can always improve the paper, right. So, there is always going to be some positive marginal benefit, right. The incremental benefit is always going to be there, right. So, you rewrote a few lines, you felt that what was there was not very clear, let me change these lines. But now notice you really have to put in a lot more effort in getting these positive improvements in the paper. So, it is likely that you are going to reach some point, possibly the sixth round, where you are still going to be able to improve the paper. There is still going to be a positive marginal benefit, but the marginal benefit actually is lower than the marginal cost, right, because the extra cost that is needed to improve the paper even more has gone up so much, right, that essentially now this marginal cost line. So, you are still going to be able to get a marginal benefit. Let us say the marginal benefit is somewhere here, right, some positive marginal benefit, but now your marginal cost has actually increased. So, this is the marginal cost and this is your marginal benefit, right. Now, why is the marginal benefit in the sixth round a lot lower than that in the first round? Those are things that I will get into a little later, but for the moment let us focus on the fact that beyond a certain number of rounds, we are going to see that the marginal cost has exceeded the marginal benefit. The essence of marginal analysis is, so you stop before marginal benefit becomes less than marginal cost. So, it tells you the stopping rule, right. So, essentially here you stop at the 5th round. In other words, do not take the 6th round, right. Now, notice the whole point of the analysis is the following. So, the point is that through marginal decision making, you can find the optimal solution. In this case, the optimal number of rounds of revision. Right? Even though at the beginning you were not clear, right? So, when you started and you asked how many rounds of revisions do I need to take to make the paper acceptable for submission, we did not know. But as we started successive rounds of revision, through each round of revision, we got a sense of the extra benefit and the extra cost, and we kept on asking, is the extra benefit, i.e. the marginal benefit, greater than the extra cost, i.e. the marginal cost. So, as long as the marginal benefit was greater than the marginal cost, we took that revision, we made that revision, and after successive rounds we found that the extra effort needed to improve the paper even more is far greater than the increment or the extra benefit or the improved version of the paper. So, through marginal analysis we can find the optimal solution, even though at the beginning, even though initially you were not sure, right. So, the simple context tells you the power of marginal analysis, right. So, you are using the comparison between marginal benefit and marginal cost to decide on what is optimal, right, what is optimal. Now, just change or flip the context. Instead of you deciding how many rounds of revisions to take, imagine a firm which is asking what is the optimal quantity of output that it should produce, right. So, we will take that example next, and what we will do is we will use the concept of marginal analysis. We will use the concept of marginal analysis to analyze a few examples, in the context of firms. In the context of optimal choice made by firms, right. But keep this larger idea in mind, that whenever you are talking about marginal analysis, what you have in mind is you are comparing two marginal things, right. You are comparing one benefit term, one marginal benefit term with one marginal cost term, and any optimality, as you will see from the examples that we will discuss, that any optimal decision will be a decision taken at the margin, right. Okay, so let us take a very specific example, and let us call it as example 1. So, consider a firm which is producing CDs, right. It is producing CDs, and it is producing particular goods, could be pens, could be pencils, bags. I have taken CDs, right. Now, suppose that the inverse demand curve, we already know what the inverse demand curve is, right. So, you have the demand function Q as a function of P. If I rewrite it as P as a function of Q, I get the inverse demand curve. The inverse demand curve or the inverse demand function is given by P as a function of Q equals 6 minus 3 Q by 5000, right. So, this is the inverse demand curve. In other words, if I wanted to draw this inverse demand curve, I will have quantity demanded on the x axis, price which is in rupees per unit or rupees per CD, and when Q is 0, the price is 6. In other words, if the price charged by the firm was 6 rupees per unit, the quantity demanded of CDs would be 0. No consumer would want to buy it. And then if Q was 10,000, the price would become 0, which means if the price was 0, the quantity demanded would be 10,000 units. So, if I connect these two points, I get my inverse demand curve. So, this is my inverse demand curve, and you can clearly figure out that at various prices, what are the quantities demanded. Alternatively, if I choose the quantity demanded, I can go back to my inverse demand curve and figure out what the price is. Okay. So, this is a firm which is producing CDs, and to produce CDs, notice it is going to incur some cost. Unlike the movie theatre example, where all the cost was some fixed cost which we did not bother about, now this CD firm is going to incur cost which is going to be a sum of two components. There is going to be a fixed cost. So, perhaps it has its factory or its plant on some premises, and it has got to pay a rent on those, on the premises where it is operating. That is a fixed cost. So, whether it produces or not, it has got to pay the rent, and to produce CDs it has got to employ labor, it has got to hire workers, it has got to hire raw materials, it will need to use electricity. All of these are what are called as variable costs, and these costs depend on the amount of output the firm is producing. So, for the moment I am just going to call the total cost incurred by the firm total cost. Later in the course we will derive the cost functions, but for the moment let us say that the cost function has already been derived. Somebody has estimated the cost function for this firm and has told us that the cost function Tc as a function of Q, right, is some component which is the fixed cost, right. So, irrespective of whether I am producing or not, I am going to incur a cost which is 1000 rupees plus a variable component which is given by Q plus Q square by 5000, right, Q plus Q square by 5000. So, this information is given to us. Now, so I will just make a note that this is your fixed cost component. Notice the fixed cost component does not depend on the output. Irrespective of whether you are producing or not, you will need to pay the rent. The remainder part is what is called as the variable cost, which depends on the amount of output that you are producing. Okay. So, this is the total cost function. Now, the firm's objective is to choose the optimal output to produce. This is the question that we are trying to answer, right. So, what is the optimal output that the firm should produce, right? Choose the optimal quantity, right. So, I want to should the optimal quantity be 2000, should it be 300 or should it be some other number, right. So, what is the optimal quantity I should produce? And let us be very specific, right, let us be very specific. Now, the objective is what is the optimal quantity to produce in order to maximize its profit, right. So, unlike the movie theatre example where the objective of the firm was to maximize its total revenue, right. Recall the example that we did last class where we had a movie theatre which was trying to maximize its revenue. Here the firm is trying to maximize its profit. Okay. So, let us first write down what the profit function is and then we will see how to solve the profit maximization problem, right. So, let us denote profit. So, I will denote, so profit is your total revenue minus total cost. So, let us first make a note of that. So, profit is total revenue minus total cost. Okay. I already know what the total cost is, right. When so the total cost is given in a mathematical form, it is given by the cost function, right. So, if I could somehow find out the total revenue, then subtracting the total cost from the total revenue would give me what is called the profit function. Now, let us compute the total revenue. So, the total revenue I can write it as a function of Q, because I know what the per unit price is, and if I multiply it by the number of units that I sell, I will get my total revenue. Think of this as the earnings of the firm. It is just that I have it in a functional form. The total revenue is a function of the quantity. So, P as a function of Q, I can write it as 6 minus 3Q by 5000 times Q, which implies that my total revenue is 6Q minus 3Q square by 5000, right. So, notice the total revenue can be written as a function of Q, and that is the advantage of writing the demand function in its inverse demand form, right, because I want to write everything the total revenue as a function of Q. Now, why did I write total revenue as a function of Q? Because notice the total cost is a function of Q, right. So, I also want to write my total revenue as a function of Q. So, if I was given the demand function, right. So, if the demand function was Q equals 6 times 5 is 30. So, 30,000 minus, so if I were to rewrite this, right. So, what will I get? So, let us just do it here. So, if I had 3Q by 5000 equals 6 minus P, then I would have had Q as a function of P as 30,000 divided by 3 minus 5,000 divided by 3 by P, and 30,000 divided by 3 would have simply been 10,000. So, if I had written it as a demand function and I would have computed the total revenue as P times Q, notice it would have been a function of P. So, my total revenue would have been a function of P, the total cost would have been a function of Q, and then I would be then comparing apples and oranges, right. So, I would not be able to do the algebra more cleanly. So, the advantage of using the inverse demand function is I can write my total revenue entirely as a function of Q, and then once I have the total cost, which is already given to me, so I will write it as Q plus Q square by 5000, and I will put the 1000 here. So, if I compute this, notice I subtract the total cost from the total revenue. So, I subtract the total cost from the total revenue. So, what will I have? So, my profit, let me denote profit as pi as a function of Q, right. I will have 6Q minus Q, which is a 5Q. I will have minus 3Q square by 5000 minus Q square by 5000. So, that is going to give me a minus 4Q square by 5000, and then I will have a minus 1000 as before, right. So, what we have done is we have used information about the inverse demand curve, we have computed the total revenue, we are already given the total cost. Subtracting the total cost from the total revenue is going to give me my profit function. And notice this profit function is nonlinear in Q, right. If I plot this, this is going to be an inverted U function, and our objective is to maximize this function by choosing the optimal Q. Now, there are 3 ways in which we will solve this problem. Now, you can very easily see that I can get the optimal Q within a few seconds by using calculus, right. If I take the derivative of the profit function, find out where the tangent to the profit curve is parallel to the x-axis, and because it is a nice inverted U, I know that that particular point has to be the maximum. But rather what we will do that, but what I suggest we do is we will first start by using marginal analysis, right. So, let us say how marginal analysis can be useful. Let us understand how marginal analysis can be useful for us in identifying whether something is an optimal or not. So, I will start with that particular example and then follow it up with using calculus to get the optimal Q star. We will do that in our next lecture. Thank you.